Hello and welcome. So Courtney, thank you so much for joining today. So Courtney is one of the hosts of Brisbane Stoics and also has created the Let's Read group on Facebook, where we look at different philosophy texts, psychoanalysis texts, and it's all about how we can, through both of those groups, just form a bit of a community looking around the idea of philosophy and how one should live. So thanks for joining.
Thank you.
So let's start with Stoicism. You are one of the hosts of the Brisbane Stoics group. So what led you into Stoicism?
Oh, so what led me into Stoicism rather than being a host of the Brisbane Stoics?
Yes.
Well, an unusual kind of book, I guess. I was reading Alain de Botton, The Consolations of Philosophy. And he gives a very short kind of rundown on the various Hellenistic philosophers, and I came across Stoicism, and I just thought, wow, this is kind of exactly my default position. And having a background in philosophy at the undergraduate level at university, I had continued to read philosophy, but mostly modern philosophy, and I found modern philosophy pretty frustrating. It's always enticing. You always feel like there's a carrot dangling in front of you, so you keep going with it. But obviously, modern philosophy doesn't resemble a philosophy of life anymore. It's asks a lot of abstract questions and heads you in the direction of kind of abstract truths. It's kind of like mental masturbation. Keeps you going, but yeah, I guess ultimately it's fairly frustrating. Whereas Stoicism immediately jumped out to someone like me who wasn't interested in religion, offering a rational kind of approach to a spiritual perspective. And I was going through a few personal issues at the time, and Stoicism really felt like a great place to begin in moving forward, in making changes in my life.
Yeah, it's always interesting the power of being able to read something as well and have it expressed in a way that makes sense, because often we can find it's really difficult to put into words what it is that we think or believe to be inherently true, and then we can read a text or an article and it just really seems to jump out and say exactly what it is that we've been unable to say ourselves.
Yeah, and I do have a view about that with Stoicism. I think that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I have a hunch that the people who are attracted to Stoicism already think like a Stoic fundamentally. I think Stoicism would be a difficult way of approaching life to try and give to everybody sort of carte blanche, across the board. Or, for example, I think it just doesn't meet with a particular kind of mindset, but there is a distinct portion of the population that are kind of made that way. So, and then as soon as they discover it, they'll say, wow, this is the way I've always thought. I spoke to Chris Fisher and he basically admitted the same thing. So it's kind of like, yeah, maybe that's the way it is.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And one of the ideas you mentioned as well is that the idea of modern philosophy just being a hodgepodge of different ideas, whereas this is a integrated whole, just kind of makes sense and is something you've always had in the back of your mind.
Not so much a hodgepodge. I would say modern Stoicism for me, this is a contentious issue obviously, is based around traditional Stoicism, but traditional Stoicism has a coherent picture and it's bound together by a belief in a providentially ordered cosmos. Modern Stoicism is not hodgepodge, but it pulls the pin on the grand project by removing the providentially ordered cosmos from the picture, and as a result it feels like its parts start to lose their orbits with each other and start to drift off into outer space. And so you do end up with these discrete component parts like cognitive behavioral therapy and whatever particular interests people gravitate towards. Whereas the traditional picture is thoroughly interwoven. You can start out talking about, determinism and fate, and come out in the physics and be talking about ethics, and it all feels like it's part of the same seamless conversation because it's bound together by something that is a kind of super glue to the whole picture.
I have been reflecting recently on the idea of these different ideas that can go out into the orbit without that integrated path, because I'm someone that loves to collect ideas to build out my own toolkit, which means I can get into the what's the word I want to use, but sometimes I can get caught out because I stop thinking about the integrated whole when I'm trying to apply my own practice of Stoicism, and instead I'm looking at what I can pull out of my toolkit to face whatever difficulty or challenge or situation that I'm in. So for someone like me that loves to have different ideas or toolkits, so it might just be the idea of what a modern Stoic might say, what you can control, or a productivity guru around focus first thing in the morning. I can get caught out sometimes and lose that integratedness around, okay, I know what to do in a situation, but am I actually layering it appropriately so I'm heading in the direction that we ought to be going in?
I think that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. That's just a modern psychological approach to dealing with your problems. But the idea is that the same thing as Stoicism? One's a philosophical approach to life, and the other one is a technical approach to life's problems. It's just that this is my opinion, but depending where we're at with our study of Stoic philosophy, we will approach life's problems differently. If you're rather novice about it and probably more inclined to psychology and coaching and things like that, you're going to take a very technical, cognitive, behavioural inspired approach to dealing with problems. Nothing wrong with that. It's a great way of dealing with issues. If you're really committed to Stoic philosophy, in my opinion, again, and you've thought it through, and I don't think this process ever ends, but you start to see beyond the merely treating problems kind of perspective, the distress management or the strategizing of how to deal with challenges in life. It goes much further beyond that into realizing that the problems that you conceive of aren't even problems at all. They're just opportunities to experience the world as it arises in your particular kind of set of circumstances, and nothing can potentially cause you any harm because you're gifted with the power of reason, and it's the views that you take of things that ultimately matter, and that just turning towards that is like a superpower. So there's no technique, there's no particular kind of, you know what I mean, like technical formulation that you need to apply. It's just having the correct orientation of your character as integrated into a world that can't possibly harm you because it's providentially designed to support the kind of being that we are. Completely different. I know it sounds weird, but it's just sort of talking apples and oranges at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. And it's the traditional spaces where I do want to operate in, and I love the idea of that integratedness. And I do get caught out because I'm someone that just loves examples. So I like to think about, okay, well, this then means X, Y, Z. So rather than the idea of just carrying out your day and responding to the events that happen, I also then like to take a pause and be like, well, hang on, that could mean you're stuck in traffic or you're running late for something, but then that quickly delves into the distress management piece. So I always get a bit caught up when I'm thinking about, well, what's an example? But it's not an example, it's just moving it through life.
Yeah, well, one thing Marcus Aurelius says is, let me remember that everything that happens is good enough for me. That's a beautiful way of dealing with whatever happens. It's saying that everything that is given to you, and that could be any appearance, so any phenomenon that occurs for you, is a gift. It's only you that labels it good or bad. So you could be sitting in traffic, and you could suddenly be in a traffic jam, and you could say, isn't this amazing? I'm alive. Doesn't matter if I'm sitting in traffic or I'm sitting wherever, or whether I'm getting out of the traffic quickly or slowly. You're enjoying the fact that you're being a human being right then and there. Whatever happens, whatever is given to me, is an opportunity to reflect on how privileged I am to be alive in the first place. That's what it's sort of asking, is like a kind of deep gratitude for being, regardless of the circumstances, because the circumstances can never get the better of you if you hold that view. So you don't need to come up with a technical toolkit.
Yeah, no, definitely. I like that approach. It's just the reorientation of maybe the default lens of being someone that likes to come up with a list of examples to be able to explain something.
Yeah, of course.
So
And a lot of people love doing that. And I think part of that is that we live in, there's this account that's given by the phenomenologists and by people like Foucault that the modern perspective is dominated by this kind of, they call it a kind of post-Cartesian understanding of what it means to be a human being. And that is, I'm a kind of separate being and the world is out there, and that my separate being, my mind if you like, can sort of hypothetically investigate the world as it is and come up with ways of dealing with it without ever having to investigate it or be in the world directly. It's always sort of slightly removed from it. So it's this disembodied ego that surveys everything around it. But the Stoic perception or perspective is completely different to that, and we don't notice because we take for granted the kind of Cartesian worldview. But what if it wasn't like that? What if they had not kind of thought it through like that? It changes the whole perspective. What it means is something more like the phenomenologists are interested in, that we're embedded in the world, that you can never take the world out of the experience. And so there's no you outside of things. There's no you that stands outside of things and then tries to come up with a technical approach to dealing with this outside circumstance. Rather, we're embedded in the world, we're a part of the world. Our understanding of the world causes the world to have that appearance for us. If you have the correct view of things, as in what is true according to nature, the nature of things, and it so happens to be that these things aren't harming you, they're not problems, they're not disadvantages, it's not a bad thing to be stuck in traffic, for example. If we took that view, because we're embedded in those things, the world becomes an easy, peaceful place to live in, where it's quite easy to manage our state of affairs and to have correct and true kind of perspectives or perceptions of the world. And the Stoic injunction or the idea is that to have that sort of view is to flourish, to be a part of the organic furniture of the world that, when situated correctly, as a kind of rational being who sees things as they are, who is embedded in things as they are, naturally grows out of those experiences and becomes their full self, for want of another word, a truly kind of happy, flourishing, natural being. Because that's what the cosmos is. It's a living, natural ecosystem.
Yeah, an integral part that we play in there, just responding as the events happen. So you came into Stoicism through a book and some life events, and then you involved in Brisbane Stoics. What led you to becoming a host?
It used to be run by a few other people. I think they just sort of lost interest or got busy, or things happened in their lives, and there was a vacuum. So I just kind of reluctantly put my hand up and started doing it, completely not knowing what I should be doing or how I should be doing it. And at the beginning, of course, it just became an opportunity to share my own kind of ideas as I was sort of exploring Pierre Hadot and taking a more traditional stance. But just being mindful of what could come out of it, allowing that context, like to flourish and see how the direction it would seem to take. And it seems to have just organically formed into something that I'm kind of happy with the direction it's taking. Again, like, this is good enough for me. And taking a more relaxed stance like that, I can see that it's become, rather than a specialist place where people lecture about Stoicism, it's a place in which the community get together and share their own thoughts and feelings in a kind of egalitarian way about Stoicism, yet trying to maintain the integrity of, the intellectual integrity, where someone or a few people are able to go, well, let's bring it back to a traditional reading of Stoicism. Do you think it's about this, or do you think it's about that? What would it be like if it was about this? So gently nudging people along in their understanding of Stoicism, but definitely emphasizing the idea that it belongs to the people, not to one particular speaker or to a particular reading necessarily.
Yeah, it's been a great group to be a part of, because we can explore those different ideas, and what's been helpful is that it's a place where we can share our own understanding and just get some really good feedback from others around how that could or couldn't be interpreted, through having a look at those ancient texts and how it's applied, and an element to kind of struggle through your own learning, particularly trying to take that integrated traditional approach. It's very different to how we might apply day-to-day living. So it's a great opportunity just to be able to examine what it is that we're doing, or how we can interpret some of those texts and ideas. So it's good to have hosts that are there to encourage us along the way. It's good.
Yeah, and I'd like other people to become equal collaborators and hosts in their own right. There's no desire for me to own it or run it or anything like that. And like you, Travis, you're showing like interest in the project, so I really value that. And people like, there are a couple other members that show great interest in looking after and growing what we've established. I see it as a real organic thing, and yeah, I see it as a community building exercise. It's a place where people can go that, even if they don't know much about Stoicism, they can be impressed by the quality of the people that attend. And I think the Stoics make a point of that one of the best ways to share the philosophy is to embody it, is to digest the teachings and allow it to grow out of your actions and your overall appearance in a sense.
Definitely. Thank you as well. It's cool to be a part of it. And I think as well, just to hear some counter views as well, because then you have to justify your own position, and it's a good way to solidify your own learning and understanding. Taking time to write an essay on something, or to speak through a presentation or a workshop, has really highlighted to me some of my own gaps in understanding or thinking. And being able to engage in group discussions is good to bring that to the forefront, because it's certainly one thing to read some text or listen to some text, but then to explain that back, to be able to justify your own position or even memory of those things, is really good. So it's great to have a community that can constantly remind you around what it is that you're striving for, and to bring back to the forefront some of the concepts that are just so different today, when you have to apply a very different lens when you're looking at a approach you might want to try and embody.
Yeah, and hopefully that gives you a perspective of growth, because you start out as an audience member perhaps, or as a spectator, and not sure of what they're talking about, and then you put your hand up and you want to be involved and present something, and you write an essay or an article on it, and suddenly you're thinking in a way that you haven't thought before. You're engaging more deeply and having a more critical kind of interrogation of your understanding, and I think that's what Stoicism is really about. It's about knowing that what's up to you or what's in your power is this critical rational capacity. And so by thinking about these things and working out how to articulate them and engaging in dialectic, so that's like having a reciprocal exchange with other people who are open to that critical analysis and exploration, being able to participate like that strengthens that critical faculty, so that you can think better and develop a perspective on these ideas. I think that's really what Stoicism calls for. And there's too many places or spaces that reserve that right only for expert speakers and academics. And I think what we're doing here is empowering the everyday speaker, because we've all got a voice and we're all part of the rational spirit of the world. We've all got our own part in that rational soul. We should all be given the opportunity to have a space where we can develop a voice that we can articulate just as ordinary people.
Yeah, and that seemed to be a feature very much of a lot of the Hellenistic philosophies. So the Stoics meeting under the Stoa with the community. We've got the Cynics that are out and about, the Epicureans, although I'm not sure how open the garden was when they moved into there. And with your interest in the Hellenistic period, particularly with the work you do as well around the Let's Read group, you did mention that you read Stoicism, it immediately appealed to you. Have you actually had a chance to really sit with some of the other contrasting philosophies of that time?
I've read a little bit around Epicureans. There's a lot of wisdom in that tradition, and clearly you can see that the main distinction will be around, I'd say, around the pleasure-virtue distinction. And I definitely agree with the Stoics in that analysis, that ultimately virtue is a form of knowledge, and the more we refine our reflective capacity and ability to use reason better, the more pleasure has very little to do with it. I mean, pleasure may have an instrumental role in things like happiness and the like, but some kind of true happiness, and I mean that in that eudaimonic sense, I really come to appreciate the argument that resides in having knowledge about one's situation, what one is, and what one's relation to others is, and what one's relation to being is. And that's why it's good to kind of critique the Cartesian view, because part of knowledge would be to try to think in ways that might not be popular according to common opinion, and to even weigh that up and to have that as part of a critique. So that feeling is that the world is a fascinating sandpit in which you can be forever content playing with these wonderful ideas, and some of them are so beautiful that they make life eminently worth living.
Yes, definitely, for sure. Well, with the idea around the sandpit and exploring those ideas, there is a role then of memory. So what's your view of memory in the soul?
Well, I'm not much of an expert on that area, but I would say, just as someone who's read very kind of casually and thought about it a little bit, and just reflecting on my own experience at the very least, is that the more we contemplate these views, the more we reflect on our reason, and the more we concentrate on kind of inscribing into our memory the maxims or the fundamental, I kind of call them structural beliefs of Stoicism, the more we concentrate on having an awareness of what Epictetus calls what is up to us, what is within our power, our hegemonicon, the more that is our kind of preoccupation, the more that is just naturally inscribed into memory. And memory may be also in the behavioral sense of stimulus response, so it becomes an automatic reaction, an automatic kind of memory. You're in a difficult situation, and what pops up in memory, for example, and even behaviorally, is the right set of knowledges for responding to that situation as they arise. So I see memory as being part of the soul in that sense, that it's not isolated, it's not some discrete thing like we often treat it as a way of recollecting a book that we read, but rather part of what motivates our behavioral and kind of moral direction in life. It occurs to us that such and such is true because we've spent so much time inscribing it into our soul, and we respond accordingly.
Yeah, and when we have these ingrained behaviours, it takes a bit of time to correct them or change them, and that means changing the memory or the knowledge or the access that we have to draw upon, so when we are faced with a situation we can behave in the new way that we want to behave. So that means we're going to have to either go back and revisit a lot of the information, so it might be some of the Stoic texts or some of the discussions, or we have to revisit how we behaved during the day. So what does that reflection look like for you? Like do you have a nightly space where you try and do a reading? I know Seneca talks a lot about, you know, once everyone's gone to bed, you journal everything that's happened in the day.
No, I don't do anything like that. Basically, I just think about it 99.999% of the day. So there are obviously a lot of intrusions in my life where I have to deal with other people or workplace stuff. But even there, I'm trying to relate it to Stoicism or my views or my ideas. I just think it's a matter of being very clear about what the good is for you. And for me, this comes from my interest in Plato's Socrates, because Socrates says we all want to be happy, and happiness comes from having the good. If we think that we've got the good, then why aren't we all happy? So there's this ongoing quest to know what the good is, and if you have the good, you'll be happy. And where you don't have the good, you have ignorance. So you have an opportunity to educate yourself and clarify what's missing in a pursuit for a correct understanding or knowledge of the good. So I see everything in life as an opportunity for doing that. So I don't have to take like a moment out to do some journaling or anything like that. I mean, if that's something that works for you, that's great, because yeah, you're right, the Stoics do recommend those sort of exercises. But I just find myself spending time thinking about basically Stoic themes most of the time, because I see them as good and beautiful, and I'm attracted to what is good and beautiful. And the more time I spend on them, the more it transforms the kind of other stuff around me, the impressions that arise, whether they're in the form of other people or other events. They all fit under the kind of general net, if you like, of what Stoicism's interested in, which is the truthful and honest examination of impressions as they arise, and assenting to true impressions rather than falling into bad habits by allowing false impressions to kind of crowd in and dominate you. So yeah, I just try and think about it all the time. I think if you want to have an exercise that you should do, then it should be an ongoing awareness of how impressions kind of work causally on your character, and that there's a part of you which is internally driven, if you like, which is an internal cause and can internally shape you. That's the thing that you want to center your experience of being on, so that you can have this experience of being in the world with external things, but always you're constantly monitoring your responses to that world. And they call that prosoche. So that would be my thing. I'd say that where I've gained the most, in my humble opinion, is by trying to be as stoically mindful as possible, as much as much of the time as possible, practicing prosoche, I think, yields enormous benefits.
That is a really good point, and practicing prosoche is something I do strive for, but the way that you've described it is helpful because I can, at least in the back of my mind, think about the reaction to the impressions and then have that constant examination going on. Because for me, coming into the realm of a study of Stoicism, it's not constant in my mind because I'm still wrapping my head around at time what is virtue, what is nature, what is these, X, Y, Z concepts. So for me, it's always handy to revisit some of those readings until it's really embedded, but I can think throughout the day around how am I reacting to an event and what's my impressions, and are they correct or are they faulty because I'm attaching a level of harm to something.
Yeah, and it also requires you to live in the now. And people can only live in the now if they feel safe in the now. So this shows you how neatly this Stoic worldview, again, kind of supports its own practices. Because if you believe that the cosmos is rationally ordered and benevolent, there's nothing to be frightened of. So you can live in the now. I think, as we know from trauma therapy and things like that, trauma-informed approaches, when people feel threatened, they tend to dissociate. They tend to look for ways to distract themselves from harmful sources. It's a natural physiological response, is to escape from difficult situations. Human beings, if they live in a world that they think is external to themselves and potentially hostile, will tend to look for ways to escape into fantasy or to dissociate in some particular ways. And so you just have to look at people's lives, and it's full of distractions, and it's full of ways of escaping the harsh truths that they find inconvenient or difficult. Stoicism is absolutely an approach to not rejecting reality, to accepting reality, facing reality, but with the view that reality is not hostile. You have to have that view before you can live in reality, because otherwise you're constantly having a mini traumatic response to being in the world. You're borderline dissociative all the time, borderline looking for the next addiction or the next distraction. Somebody who wants to live in the world and take the benefits and to flourish in the world has to understand and believe that the world is a safe place to be present in. If you can't be safe, then you can't be present. So before you can practice prosoche, you have to convince yourself, we have to realize that the world is beautiful and it means you no harm, and that it's a gift to be here, and that whatever occurs, seemingly good or bad in appearance, is just more food for you to digest and to grow as a moral character.
I had not thought of it that way, and I really like it, and it makes a lot of sense now that I've heard it and can reflect on it, because I just like to geek out so much on those examples and those responses. So whilst I might be a big proponent on removing distractions from your life, so getting off social media, screen time down, or what happens when your amygdala hijacks, and all of these, what we now look like through our discussion, distress techniques, it's just changing it around. Well, I'm doing this so I can be more present in the moment, but if you change your outlook so the world is a safe place and it's about being in the moment and enjoying it,
then your amygdala doesn't hijack your frontal cortex. You're present because it's not having a distress response every 5 seconds.
No, I really like that. I had not thought of it that way, so it's really good. You mentioned earlier that you also like Plato's Socrates and examining some of those texts, and you have also been heavily involved as a host and an organizer for the Let's Read group. What led you to create another group, or to create a second one in the first place?
Well, the true story is that I had a friend who was a professor of psychology or philosophy, both, at university, and she had a mental breakdown and she lost her job. And I really wanted to help her through that period, and I know how much she loved sharing philosophy with other people. So I set up the group basically to give her an opportunity to have a group of people to talk to about the things that she loved while she was recovering. Of course, the only people I knew who might join such a group were a bunch of Stoic-minded people. So, although it was really helpful, I think, in her recovery, and she really enjoyed it, and she introduced us to the phenomenologists, which I still find really useful in thinking about ancient philosophy. I think ultimately she kind of got frustrated with it because she didn't like Stoicism at all, and she was surrounded by a bunch of Stoics. So she eventually quit. Mind you, you know, I think it was a wonderful way of helping her to recover, because she got better, not because of the book club, but the book club would have been just another thing that helped her through. And it's made me realize, I often reflect on it, there's a kind of therapy called Bibliotherapy, which is around reading books and sharing books with a group of people as a kind of therapeutic approach in itself. And I've noticed that I think our little book club has the potential, and at times does play an important role in a kind of therapeutic for people in it. And you know, I felt that myself because, pardon me, the book club, in its most basic sense, is a place. It's a place where a person feels like they can belong. Again, like the Brisbane Stoics, where all voices are recognised and welcomed. No one's made to feel foolish or like they don't have anything important to kind of contribute. And it becomes a supportive place in that regard. Ostensibly, the support tends to be around supporting you to learn the content of the book, but that is obviously mirrored in the support that we give each other as human beings in our learning. So the book club is really, really cool, actually. I did an undergraduate I did mine in psychology, but I did my minor in philosophy. And I can honestly say that 3 years or whatever it's been that I've spent in the book club, I've learned 10 times more philosophy than I ever learnt in my undergraduate experience. The thing that astounds me is that people go to university and spend thousands of dollars on an expensive, education, but very few people actually bother to read the text and join in the book club. What we found is there's just a core group of people, probably between 6 and 10 people, that are interested in participating at the level of reading the book and coming to the meetups online and discussing them. But if they did, I have no doubt in thinking that the people who really get into it and get involved in the readings would benefit much more than they even would than if they were at university studying philosophy directly. And the books we've covered so far, and I think having a bit of an idea about university structures and curriculums, for example, has helped us in design our kind of approach to the readings. They haven't been completely all over the shop, for example. We've studied Stoicism, and we're systematically working through some books on the history of Hellenistic philosophy. In that case, we're reading Nussbaum's Therapy of Desire, which is a meaty tome. It's about 500 pages. But generally, not to put people off, we only read on a regular basis short chapters or shorter articles, And we've covered things like, let me think, what have we read? Boethius, Consolations of Philosophy, St. Augustine, a real mixed bag. We even did a short curriculum on the phenomenologists where we looked at Hannah Arendt and Husserl and a couple of European phenomenologists that aren't particularly famous in the West. Yeah, I think if you want to get a really good general understanding of philosophy, a book club can be a really wonderful place to go for that.
Yes, and it's been a great way to be exposed to different texts and the way that they can integrate together, because we might be reading Plato's Apology and then having an understanding around some of the Stoic ideas. You can connect the ideas and see how they've evolved over time. But for me, the biggest learning, only being relatively new to the book club, is the very distinct difference in my mind between reading a text for pleasure or personal learning, but then reading it in a way that you can then pick out core themes for discussion is very different. And I think if I was to just pick up some of those classics and just read it, the depth of knowledge or information that I'm extracting is nothing compared to what I've gained from the book club, because you have to pick out those core themes that are returned to, or how something is structured. It really has enhanced that learning.
And definitely, I think it's been a good thing that we've focused on the ancient root of Western philosophy. Like, we've spent time with Aristotle and Plato, and Plutarch and the like, and reading that sort of material allows you then, when you dip into, say, Descartes or some of the later traditions, to see the direct current, like the particular concerns with skepticism, for example, that Descartes has. We can trace right back to the early skeptics in the Hellenistic period and the arguments the Stoics are having with them, and we can see how for us, it's not weird that these ideas come up, because they're perennial ideas. They're things that people have been working on for hundreds, if not a couple of thousand years. And it makes it feel like, because it's a true feeling, that you're participating in a very old conversation with the greatest minds of our intellectual tradition. You feel like you're a part of something that's really important. And to participate in that gives us true depth. And I've often thought that, in Australia we talk about respecting other people's cultures, and for example, it's a hot topic at the moment that Indigenous people's cultures be respected and understood for the value that they have, and how important it is for Indigenous people to have a sense of culture. Well, for us Western people, our cultural identity in large part kind of comes from a Western intellectual tradition that starts with the Greco-Roman kind of traditions. And we don't know that. In a sense, most of us don't have access to our cultural stories and our cultural narratives. And for us in the Western philosophical tradition, which informs all of our science and perspective on the world, those stories, those narratives, we just don't know the ins and outs of them, the details of them. We don't participate with them anymore. We've become passive receivers of the wisdom as is delivered to us by experts, like by scientists and by the people who get to make decisions for us about, how we should consume the end products of that knowledge. But to go back and to participate at the, either at the beginning of that conversation, early in the Greeks, or to follow it through and look at how it kind of transforms through the kind of Christian era, for example, or then how it's reinterpreted and kind of restructured again in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. To really go back and to dig in at that level gives you a deep respect for your for what it means to be a Western person whose spirit, whose very culture is grounded in this beautiful conversation and this beautiful culture that we can, which is entirely rational, a kind of rational spirituality, that we can find, great, what's the word, succor, a great consolation if we go back and spend time sitting with it. And personally, I find it a great support for my prosoche is to go and read those wonderful paragons of wisdom in the Western philosophical tradition, because it just supports my progress, makes me realize what it means to be a Western person who loves his cultural heritage and finds great place and meaning as a person who has grown out of that historical and kind of intellectual culture.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end it for today's conversation. It's interesting to connect back to those origin roots and to see how it evolves over time, but the main benefit too is just that participation by engaging in those texts and talking about it and understanding and just moving into that practice space of just living out a philosophy as a way of life, which was just so common back then, and as you said, it's not given much thought nowadays around the encompassing of the whole.
There's a great line in Seneca's on the shortness of life that stands out for me when I read it, and he says something like, we don't get to choose our family, our mother, father, brothers and sisters and things like that, but at some point in our life we get to choose which house we're born under in terms of our allegiance to a philosophical tradition. And he says once we do that, we reap the true rewards and benefits, the inheritance of that particular rich intellectual family. And that's wonderful because it far outweighs any kind of, family privilege that we might take from, something as small as our biological family. Instead, we benefit from, hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years of the work that's been done in these grand philosophical families. And you can call then Seneca your uncle and Cicero your uncle and maybe Socrates your grandfather.
Yeah.
And what a wonderful and beautiful family to belong to.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, thanks so much for your time, Courtney. Really appreciate it. And if anyone wants to know more about some of the groups that we're involved in, definitely check out the website brisbanestoics.com. Has some articles and information, links to some YouTube channels if you want to learn more, as well as events if you're Brisbane based, want to come along, or links to the Let's Read Club. So thanks again, Courtney.
Thank you,
next
Travis.
time.
Thanks.